Okay, so quick question. When you picture your first solo trip, what pops into your head? Is it something huge, like backpacking through Southeast Asia for a month, or winging it across 3 countries with a rucksack? Because for years that's what I thought solo travel had to look like. And if that's not you, if that sounds like an actual nightmare rather than a dream, because same, I want you to know something. That's not the only version of solo travel that counts. Not even close. Welcome back to the Anxious Solo Female Traveller. I'm Katie, and this is the podcast for women who dream of solo travel, but anxiety or overthinking or 100 different what-ifs have kept that dream sitting on the maybe someday list. I've solo travelled to 24 countries now, with anxiety and social anxiety along for the ride every single time. And today I want to do something a little different. Because normally I'm talking about the mindset side of things. But today I want to talk about the actual practical, okay, but where do I even go side of things. Because I think we skip past this bit. We get all the pep talks about confidence and mindset, and then we're just left staring at a map with absolutely no idea where to start. So today I'm talking through some of my favourite destinations in Europe for a first solo trip. But I want to be really clear about something before we get into it. This isn't a top 10 destinations you have to visit before you die kind of dramatic episode. And I'm not interested in the flashiest places or the most photogenic places or even whatever's trending on your For You page this month. Because when you're anxious, exciting isn't actually the most useful filter for choosing a first trip. Easy is. But I promise you, easy does not mean boring. So let's start with the biggest myth I want to bust. I think a lot of us assume that our first solo trip has to somehow prove something. That it has to be big and bold and Instagram worthy, or it doesn't really count as brave. And I used to believe that too. But here's what I've actually learned 5 years and 24 countries in. The best first solo trip isn't the one that impresses anyone. It's the one that you can actually relax into and enjoy. Because think about it for a second. You're already doing something huge just by going alone. You don't also need the destination to fight you the whole way through. So when I'm choosing anywhere solo, but especially for a first solo trip, I'm looking for a few specific things. Number 1, a pace that isn't going to overwhelm me. Number 2, transport that's simple and not some logistical puzzle. Number 3, little to no language barrier, so I've got more headspace to actually just enjoy being there. And number 4, somewhere with a safety reputation that I can trust, rather than just hope for the best. That's genuinely it. That's the whole formula. And once I started choosing my trips that way, instead of chasing wherever looked good online, solo travel got so much less stressful, almost instantly. So let's get into some of the places that tick those boxes. And along the way, I'll tell you the actual stories behind a few of them, because some of these really do hold a special place in my heart. Okay, so if you want to take the language barrier completely off your plate for the first trip, there are 2 places I want to point you to: Edinburgh and Gibraltar. Let's start with Edinburgh. It's one of the easiest cities I could ever recommend for a first solo trip, because the city centre is small enough that you can walk almost everywhere. Which sounds like a small thing, but really it genuinely isn't. Because when you're not spending mental energy trying to decode a tram map or work out which platform you need at a train station, you've actually got headspace left over to just enjoy where you are and what you're doing. And if you fancy getting a little further out of the city, without the stress of driving yourself or navigating public transport, you can even join a small group tour out into the Scottish Highlands from right there in the city. Which, side note, I much prefer to a big coach tour. Small groups never feel quite as overwhelming for me. And now Gibraltar, which probably isn't first on anyone's list, but I actually lived there for a while, so I know it properly inside and out. It's tiny, it's safe, and English is spoken literally everywhere because it's a British overseas territory. And because it's so tiny, you can genuinely get your bearings within a day. And there's something honestly so reassuring about that. Knowing that even if you take a wrong turn, you're never really that far from where you need to get to. Plus, yes, you'll see the famous rock and the monkeys, obviously. Now, if a full-blown city still feels like a lot to you right now, that's also completely valid. And that's exactly why I wanted to talk about some smaller, low-key towns or cities. Let's start with Montreux in Switzerland, because this is where my own solo travel story began. I wanted to go because of the Christmas market there. Specifically, I wanted to see the flying Santa who plays a ukulele on a wire above the market. And I know how that sounds, but it's very cool, I promise. But I was terrified before that trip. Genuinely, I had zero confidence and my anxiety and social anxiety were spiraling. I even booked myself a ridiculously expensive 5-star hotel right by the market, just so I had one less thing to worry about before I landed. And I still nearly talked myself out of that trip, multiple times. But Montreux is small and it's relaxed. It sits right on the lake, and I found that I settled into it so quickly. And I think that that's exactly why it stuck to me and why I've been back several times since. Then there's Heidelberg in Germany, which is such a great way to experience the country without the overwhelm of somewhere like Berlin or Munich. It's compact and charming, and it's got this pace that just never feels rushed. I especially love Heidelberg in autumn when the colours across the whole city and by the river are honestly stunning. And there's also a walk up to Heidelberg Castle that I'd recommend to anyone visiting. You get to the top and there's this peaceful spot looking right out over the river and the old town, and it's just so quiet up there. And then finally, for towns and smaller cities, there's Salzburg in Austria, which I always describe as the quieter, calmer alternative to Vienna. And Vienna is stunning, don't get me wrong, I've been there several times. But it's also a capital city, so it comes with the crowds and the noise and about 100 things all competing for your attention at once. Whereas Salzburg gives you that same taste of the Austrian history and music and culture, but at a pace that actually feels manageable. And side note that if you've ever seen the film The Sound of Music, there's a tour in Salzburg that takes you around the filming locations, which was honestly one of the highlights of my trip. Okay, so here's the pattern I want you to notice, because it can apply to any destination, whether it's on this list or not. Every single one of these places lets you ease in gently, and none of them ask you to run before you can walk. And that brings me to the next group of places, because some of my absolute favourite solo trips have also been some of the calmest. Stockholm is without doubt my favourite city I've ever solo travelled to. And to be honest, I know it's Sweden's capital, but it really doesn't feel like a capital to me. And I think that's because it's surrounded by water, so you can hop on a ferry and be out of the centre within minutes, which makes the whole place feel calmer than any capital has any right to be honest. I stay in Gamla stan right by the water, and just being there instantly calms me down. And even on my first visit to Stockholm, which happened to coincide with the King of Sweden's Jubilee, so I'm not kidding, the royal yachts of Norway and Denmark were literally moored right outside my hotel. But it was a lot, and there was a lot of celebrations going on around the city, but it still never felt overwhelming or too crowded. But if you do want a slower day out from the city, Vaxholm is this beautiful, quiet archipelago town, and getting there by ferry is honestly half of the experience. I highly, highly recommend a day trip if you're ever visiting Stockholm. And then there's Bergen in Norway, which is compact and scenic and entirely walkable. I don't think I used public transport once there apart from getting to and from the airport. Norway as a whole felt like such a safe country to me, and Bergen is such a lovely, gentle interruption to that, especially compared to busier Oslo. One of my favourite things I did there was a boat trip out to the Mostraumen Fjord, which is a really low-key way to see some of the proper dramatic Norwegian nature without needing any kind of complicated itinerary or logistics. And Bergen actually brings me to one of the most anxiety-friendly trips I've ever done, which isn't really a destination at all, but I just had to include it. The Norway Coastal Express. I sailed the round trip, which is 12 days with Havila Voyages, and it might just be one of my favourite trips I've ever taken. I especially loved that I was never once forced onto a group dining table, which, if you've ever done a big cruise, you know that that's not always guaranteed. The staff also remembered me every time I came back and always stopped for a chat, but it never felt intrusive. It stayed low-key the whole way through and never once triggered my social anxiety, which I genuinely worried about beforehand. I spent a lot of time just out on the deck of the ship with my camera, watching the spectacular scenery pass by. And also, if a full itinerary of constant decisions feels overwhelming to you, that's exactly why something like this can work so well. The format makes a lot of those decisions for you, and less to plan really does mean less to feel anxious about. And then for the last group, I think a lot of us assume a beach trip automatically means backpackers, hostels, packed beaches, and party crowds, but that's genuinely not the only way to do it. Kotor in Montenegro gave me one of the most memorable days of any solo trip I've ever taken. I spent the whole day out on a yacht sailing the Bay of Kotor with loads of space to spread out and absolutely no pressure to socialise unless I wanted to. It was quiet and calm, and it's such a good option if you want that coastal atmosphere without the crowds you get somewhere like Dubrovnik just up the coast. Then there's Korcula in Croatia, which feels like a proper island getaway, but without being too remote or difficult to get to. You reach it by ferry from Split, and there's something so calming about that slower journey rather than just rushing between connecting flights. And finally, Valletta in Malta is genuine proof that a capital city does not have to be overwhelming. It's small and walkable, and English is actually an official language there, so again, no barrier to add pressure. And if you want a bit of beach time too, the ferry over to Slima is simple and gives you the coast without any complicated planning on top. So that's a lot of places, I know. And if you're sitting there thinking, okay, but how do I actually choose? This is my advice. Don't overthink it. And I know that's easier said than done for someone with an anxious brain. But genuinely, just notice which one made you feel that mix of excited and, oh wait, I feel like I could actually do that. Because that feeling is one worth following. Because here's the one thing I really want you to take from this whole episode, whether you pick one of these destinations or not. Easy does not have to mean boring. Every single place I've just talked you through is stunning, and every one of them has given me memories I wouldn't trade for anything. Easy just means that you get to actually relax into the experience, instead of spending the whole trip managing complicated logistics or an overwhelmingly busy city, on top of everything your anxiety's already doing. And I think that's such an important thing to hear, because so much of the travel content out there implies that your first trip has to be the boldest, biggest thing you've ever done. Otherwise it doesn't really count. But I think that your trip doesn't have to tick off 5 bucket list items just to be worth doing. So here's your one small step for this week. And no, it's not researching every single one of these places at once, because that would just send your brain into overdrive, and we don't want that. I just want you to pick one place from everything we've talked about today, and go and read a little more about it. Because once you've got a destination that feels possible rather than aspirational, planning it becomes so much less overwhelming. And if you're sitting there thinking, okay, I think I've picked somewhere, but now what? That's exactly why I've built my free email course, 7 Days to Your First Solo Trip, Even If You're Anxious. It walks you through one small, doable step each day, so you're never trying to figure out an entire trip in one go. Just like we've talked about today. Because knowing where I wanted to go was never really the hard part for me. It was turning that destination into an actual booked, real trip without spiralling along the way. I'll pop the link in the show notes or the description if you're watching this on YouTube. And in the next episode, I'm going to be sharing my honest experience of whether you can actually solo travel with anxiety. And I'll be sharing all of it, so the good, the hard, and everything in between. If that sounds like something you need to hear, Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next episode.